The gunshot on the distant hillside made Virginia Thorne drop her cup, shattering porcelain across the wooden floorboards of Widow Keller's boarding house. Her slender fingers trembled as she knelt to gather the pieces, eyes darting nervously toward the windows facing Laramie's dusty Main Street. Wyoming Territory, 1873, was no place for a woman with nerves as raw as freshly skinned hide, but Virginia had nowhere else to go. "I'll fetch a rag," announced Widow Keller, her heavy footsteps retreating to the kitchen, leaving Virginia alone with her racing heart and the judging stares of the other boarders. Virginia kept her head down as she collected the broken pieces, fighting back tears of embarrassment. 3 months in Laramie had done nothing to steady her nerves. Every slamming door, every raised voice, every unexpected sound sent her heart hammering against her ribs. The nightmares that had driven her west still haunted her sleep. "Let me help you with that, madam," came a deep voice, warm as whiskey and gentle as a summer breeze. Virginia's head snapped up to find a tall man kneeling beside her, his weathered hands carefully picking up the larger shards. She hadn't heard him approach unusual, given his size and the telltale jingle of spurs that announced his profession. His broad-brimmed hat shadowed eyes the color of a clear Wyoming sky, and a respectful distance remained between them as he helped. "Thank you, Mr." She managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mackenzie. Matthew Mackenzie. Most folks just call me Mac." He offered a smile that crinkled the sun-weathered corners of his eyes. "Just arrived in town yesterday." Virginia nodded but didn't offer her name in return. Experience had taught her caution around men, especially those who wore guns as naturally as others wore watches. Widow Keller returned with a rag and a small dustpan. "I see you've met our newest boarder, Miss Thorne. Mr. Mackenzie's taken the room at the end of the hall." Matthew Mackenzie tipped his hat to Virginia. "Miss Thorne." Virginia murmured a polite acknowledgement before quickly excusing herself, retreating to her small room where she could breathe again. She pressed her back against the closed door, willing her heart to slow. A cowboy. Living under the same roof. The thought alone was enough to make her want to pack her meager belongings and flee, though she had nowhere to go. At supper that evening, Virginia kept her eyes fixed on her plate as Widow Keller made introductions around the table. Besides herself, there were 2 elderly sisters who taught at the town school, a railroad clerk with spectacles that magnified his eyes to owl-like proportions. And now, Matthew Mackenzie, who'd cleaned up for dinner but still carried the unmistakable aura of a man who lived by his wits and his gun. "What brings you to Laramie, Mr. Mackenzie?" asked the elder of the 2 sisters, Mrs. Howell. "Work," he replied simply. "Cattle drive coming through next week. I'm riding ahead to make arrangements." "A trail boss, then?" asked the clerk, clearly impressed. "Something like that," Matthew answered, his eyes briefly meeting Virginia's before she quickly looked away. The conversation flowed around Virginia like water around a stone. She ate quickly, keeping her responses brief when directly addressed. When a door slammed somewhere in the house, she flinched so violently that her fork clattered against her plate. Matthew Mackenzie noticed. Virginia could feel his eyes on her, assessing, measuring. She excused herself as soon as politeness allowed, fleeing once more to the sanctuary of her room. The next morning, Virginia rose early as was her habit. As the town's new seamstress, she had orders to complete, and the solitude of dawn offered blessed peace before the cacophony of the day began. She moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast and tea, jumping when she turned to find Matthew Mackenzie already seated at the table. "My apologies, Miss Thorne," he said, rising slightly in his chair. "Didn't mean to startle you." "It's quite all right," she managed, though her heart hammered traitorously in her chest. "Early riser too, I see," he commented. Sipping from a steaming mug of coffee, Virginia nodded, focusing intently on buttering her bread rather than meeting his gaze. "Headed to your shop." She looked up in surprise. "How did you know I have a shop?" A smile tugged at his mouth. "Small towns. News travels fast. Heard the new seamstress does fine work. Been meaning to get a tear in my coat mended." Virginia found herself studying him properly for the first time. His face was lean and tanned, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. Not handsome in the conventional way of city men, but compelling a face shaped by wind and sun and purpose. "I could look at it for you," she offered, surprising herself with the volunteered service. His smile widened. "Much obliged. I'll bring it by your shop later, if that's agreeable." Virginia nodded and returned to her breakfast. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence until Widow Keller's heavy tread on the stairs announced the day's official beginning. Virginia's shop was a small affair tucked between the general store and the barber's. The previous tenant had been a milliner who'd left to marry a rancher, and the space still held shelves designed for hat displays that Virginia had repurposed for bolts of fabric. A large window faced the street, allowing ample light for her detailed work while giving her a view of the comings and goings of Laramie. She was hand-stitching the hem of a dress when the bell above her door jingled. Virginia looked up to see Matthew Mackenzie filling her doorway, his hat in his hands and a folded coat draped over one arm. "Miss Thorne," he greeted with a slight bow of his head. "Mr. Mackenzie." She set her work aside and stood. "Please call me Mac. Never did care much for formalities." Virginia hesitated. "I prefer to maintain professional relationships with my clients, Mr. Mackenzie." If her coolness offended him, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded respectfully and approached her counter, laying his coat down. "Caught it on a fence post," he explained, indicating a long tear along the seam. "Not much good at needlework myself." Virginia examined the garment. "This won't take long to repair. Would tomorrow morning be soon enough? More than sufficient. What do I owe you?" She named a fair price, which he agreed to without haggling. As he turned to leave, a group of cowboys rode past the shop, whooping and hollering, one firing his pistol into the air. The sudden noise sent Virginia diving behind her counter, a small cry escaping her lips before she could stifle it. When the noise subsided, and her panic receded enough for her to become aware of her surroundings again, Matthew Mackenzie was crouched beside her, his expression concerned but not pitying. "They're gone now," he said quietly. "Just some ranch hands blowing off steam." Virginia's cheeks burned with shame as she rose on shaky legs. "I apologize for my behavior." "No need for apologies," he replied, standing as well but maintaining a respectful distance. "Plenty of folk get jumpy around gunfire. Smart reaction, truth be told." But it wasn't just gunfire, and they both knew it. Virginia had reacted to the men's voices as much as to the shot. "I should get back to work," she said, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. Matthew Mackenzie studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Miss Thorne, I don't mean to pry, but are you in some kind of trouble?" The directness of his question startled her. "No," she answered too quickly. "Then, not any more," he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But if trouble does come looking for you, I'd be obliged if you'd let me know." Virginia stared at him, bewildered by the offer. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." A sad smile crossed his face. "Known plenty of folk who could have used help and didn't get it when they needed it most. Don't aim to be the one who walks away." With that, he placed his hat back on his head, tipped it slightly in her direction, and left the shop, the bell tinkling cheerfully in his wake. Virginia found herself staring at the closed door long after he'd gone, unsure what to make of Matthew Mackenzie or his offer of assistance. Over the next several days, Virginia observed the cowboy from a distance. He kept busy, meeting with merchants and the local banker, securing arrangements for the incoming cattle drive. Despite his obvious capability with the gun at his hip, he seemed to prefer words to weapons. More than once, she watched from her shop window as he diffused tensions between local townsfolk and visiting cowboys with nothing more than his calm presence and measured speech. When he returned to collect his mended coat, he thanked her sincerely and paid without comment on the expert quality of her work. If not for the way his eyes lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, she might have thought him merely polite rather than interested. "Will you be leaving once the cattle drive passes through?" she asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "That depends," he replied. "On what?" His mouth curved in a half-smile. "On whether I find reason to stay." Virginia lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond to the implication in his words. "Good day, Miss Thorne," he said, leaving her to her thoughts. That evening at supper, Widow Keller announced that she would be hosting a small gathering the following Saturday. "Just a few friends for music and conversation," she explained. "Nothing elaborate, but it would please me greatly if all my boarders would attend." Virginia's stomach clenched at the thought of an evening spent in close quarters with strangers, but she couldn't refuse her landlady's direct invitation. "Count me in," said Matthew, his eyes briefly meeting Virginia's across the table. "Been too long since I heard proper music." The night of the gathering arrived all too quickly. Virginia spent an extra hour on her appearance, telling herself it was simply proper respect for Widow Keller's hospitality that motivated her care. She wore her best dress, a deep blue that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd swept up in a simple but elegant style. When she descended the stairs, the parlor was already half full of Laramie's respectable citizens. A man sat at Widow Keller's piano, playing a cheerful tune while others conversed in small groups. Virginia hesitated at the threshold, fighting the urge to retreat to her room. "You look lovely," came Matthew's voice from beside her, making her start. "Thank you," she replied, glancing up to find him freshly shaved and dressed in a clean shirt, his usual trail-worn appearance transformed into something closer to a gentleman's. "Not much for crowds myself," he confided, keeping his voice low. "Spent too many years with just my horse for company. Makes these gatherings feel like being trapped in a chicken coop during feeding time." The unexpected comparison surprised a genuine laugh from Virginia, a sound so foreign to her own ears that she quickly stifled it behind her hand. Matthew's eyes crinkled at the corners. "That's a nice sound. Your laugh." Virginia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't do much of it these days." "Shame," he replied simply. Widow Keller approached, bustling with hostess energy. "Miss Thorne, Mr. Mackenzie, come, you must meet Dr. and Mrs. Preston. They're new to Laramie as well." The evening progressed more pleasantly than Virginia had anticipated. Matthew stayed nearby, not hovering but present, a steady presence that somehow made the crush of people less overwhelming. When conversation lagged, he filled the silence with observations about cattle drives or anecdotes about places he'd seen that made even Virginia curious about the world beyond Laramie's dusty streets. As the night wore on, someone suggested dancing. Furniture was pushed aside and the piano player increased his tempo. Virginia retreated to a corner, watching as couples took to the makeshift dance floor. "May I have this dance?" Matthew asked, appearing before her with an outstretched hand. Virginia hesitated. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," he confessed with a grin. "We can be terrible together." Something about his easy acceptance of imperfection loosened a knot inside her chest. Virginia placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the floor. His hand was warm at her waist, respectfully placed and yet steady. They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm, but soon were gliding with surprising grace among the other dancers. Virginia found herself relaxing incrementally until she was almost enjoying herself. When someone accidentally bumped into them from behind, Virginia tensed immediately, her body going rigid in Matthew's arms. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "Just Mr. Finch. Man's got 2 left feet and has been stepping on toes all evening." Virginia forced herself to breathe, to focus on the pressure of Matthew's hand at her waist, solid and grounding. "That's it," he encouraged as she gradually relaxed again. "You're doing fine." When the music ended, Virginia excused herself to step outside for fresh air. The night was cool but not cold, stars scattered like diamond dust across the Wyoming sky. She breathed deeply, letting the quiet soothe her frayed nerves. "Mind if I join you?" Matthew asked, keeping a respectful distance as he stepped onto the porch. Virginia shook her head and he settled against the railing a few feet away. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for the dance and for—" "No thanks needed," he replied when she trailed off. They stood in companionable silence, listening to the muted sounds of conversation and music from inside. A dog barked somewhere down the street, and Virginia flinched at the sudden sound. Matthew noticed he always noticed, but didn't comment immediately. Finally, he said, "Whoever he was, he did a number on you." Virginia stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Matthew turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light spilling from the windows. "Miss Thorne, Virginia, if I may, I've seen your kind of fear before. It's not the general wariness of someone new to Western territories. It's specific, personal." Virginia's throat tightened, words trapped behind years of silence. "You don't have to tell me," he continued gently. "That's your business, but I want you to know something." He paused, waiting until she met his gaze. "You can be loud here. You can take up space. You can exist without fear. And anyone who tries to make it otherwise will answer to me." Virginia stared at him, this man who had somehow seen through her carefully constructed walls to the terrified woman beneath. Tears pricked at her eyes. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you care what happens to me?" Matthew's expression softened. "Because everyone deserves peace, Virginia. Even you. Especially you." A tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. Matthew reached slowly into his pocket and offered her a clean handkerchief, which she accepted gratefully. "I should return inside," she said after composing herself. "Widow Keller will wonder where I've gone." Matthew nodded but didn't move to follow her. "I'll be along shortly." Virginia paused at the door. "Mr. Mackenzie." "Mac," he corrected gently. "Mac," she conceded. "Thank you." The cattle drive arrived the following Tuesday, bringing with it a surge of activity in Laramie. Virginia watched from her shop window as Matthew directed operations with calm efficiency, his commanding presence evident even from a distance. Cowhands respected him. That much was clear from how they jumped to follow his instructions. Business picked up for Virginia as well, with cowboys bringing in garments for repair before their journey continued north. She worked longer hours to accommodate the increased demand, often returning to the boarding house well after dark, exhausted but satisfied with her growing success. On Thursday evening, she was so engrossed in finishing a particularly challenging repair that she didn't notice the time until the street outside her window had grown dark. Quickly packing up her supplies, Virginia locked the shop and hurried toward the boarding house, keeping to the better-lit portions of the street. As she passed an alleyway between the saloon and the gunsmith shop, rough hands suddenly grabbed her, dragging her into the shadows. Virginia tried to scream, but a calloused palm clamped over her mouth. Thought you could hide from me, didn't you? Growled a voice that sent ice through her veins. Tracked you across 3 territories, Ginny girl. Virginia struggled against the iron grip of Edgar Payne, the man she'd fled Chicago to escape. His breath was hot against her face, reeking of whiskey and malice. "You're my wife," he snarled, "and you're coming home where you belong." Virginia bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth. Edgar cursed and loosened his grip enough for her to wrench free. "I am not your wife," she cried, backing away. "The marriage was annulled. You have no claim on me." Edgar's face twisted with rage. "No court takes a wife from her husband. You're mine until death, girl." He lunged for her again, but froze at the distinctive click of a revolver being cocked. "The lady disagrees," said Matthew, stepping into the mouth of the alley, his gun trained steadily on Edgar. "And I'm inclined to respect her opinion on the matter." Edgar sneered. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. This is between me and my wife." "Ex-wife," Virginia corrected, her voice stronger than she would have thought possible with Edgar's presence mere feet away. "And if you'd read the papers, instead of using them to line your boots, you'd know the judge granted the annulment on grounds of cruelty and abandonment." Matthew's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You heard the lady. She's not yours." "Never was, by the sound of it. Now I suggest you find the nearest train station and purchase a ticket back east." Edgar's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. "I ain't leaving without what's mine." The movement of Matthew's gun was so subtle Virginia almost missed it. One moment it was aimed at Edgar's chest, the next at a spot just beside Edgar's ear. The shot rang out, deafeningly loud in the confined space of the alley. Edgar flinched violently as brick dust scattered from where the bullet had embedded itself in the wall. "Next one won't miss," Matthew stated calmly. "And I won't aim for the wall." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the lack of bluster or bravado, seemed to finally penetrate Edgar's alcohol-fueled rage. His posture sagged slightly as he reassessed the situation. "This ain't over," he spat at Virginia, but his retreat had already begun. "Actually, it is," Matthew replied, his gun never wavering. "Miss Thorne is under my protection now. You come near her again, you even think about her too hard, and I'll know. And then we'll have a very different conversation." Edgar glared at them both before backing away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the alley. The moment he was gone, Virginia's legs gave way. Matthew was at her side instantly, holstering his weapon to catch her before she hit the ground. "I've got you," he murmured, his arm strong around her waist. "You're safe now." Virginia clung to him, shaking uncontrollably as the full impact of what had just happened washed over her. Edgar had found her. After all her caution, all her fear, he'd tracked her to Laramie. "He'll come back," she whispered. "He never gives up." Matthew's arm tightened around her. "Let him try." They walked in silence back to the boarding house, Matthew's steady presence beside her the only thing keeping Virginia upright. Once inside, he guided her to the parlor where a fire still burned low in the grate. "Sit," he instructed gently. "I'll fetch you some tea." Virginia sank into an armchair, staring blankly at the flames. When Matthew returned with a steaming cup, she accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. "How did you find me?" she asked after taking a sip. "Followed you," he admitted without shame. "Been keeping an eye on you since the day we met. Something told me you might need watching over." Under normal circumstances, Virginia might have resented such surveillance. Tonight she could only feel grateful. "You followed me every night." "Just until you were safely inside," he confirmed. "Didn't seem right. A woman walking alone after dark in a town full of strangers." Virginia studied him over the rim of her cup. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," he replied, echoing his words from the night of the gathering. "But I think it's time you told me the whole story, Virginia. Who is Edgar Payne and why are you so afraid of him?" Virginia took a deep breath, steeling herself for a confession she'd never made aloud. "He was my husband, briefly. I was 17 when we met in Chicago. He seemed charming, attentive, everything a young girl dreams of. My parents had died the year before, and I was living with an aunt who saw me as more burden than blessing. Edgar offered escape." Matthew's expression remained neutral, but his eyes never left her face. "We married within 2 months of meeting. The change came almost immediately, first just criticism, then shouting, then." She swallowed hard. His temper was unpredictable. Anything could set him off, a meal not to his liking, a word spoken at the wrong moment, even silence when he wanted conversation. "He hit you," Matthew stated flatly. Virginia nodded, her fingers unconsciously tracing a scar at her hairline. "Among other things. He'd apologize afterwards, swear it would never happen again. I believed him the first few times." "How did you get away?" "After 8 months, he disappeared for nearly 2 weeks. I thought perhaps he'd abandoned me or been killed in one of his drunken brawls. I was relieved." She laughed bitterly. What kind of wife feels relief at the thought of her husband's death? But when he returned, the beating was worse than ever before. "I knew then I wouldn't survive another year with him." Virginia took another sip of tea, gathering her courage to continue. "I fled to a women's shelter run by a church across town. The minister there helped me file for annulment and hide until the paperwork was processed. When Edgar discovered where I was, the minister arranged passage west for me. I've been running ever since Kansas City, Denver, now Laramie." Matthew was silent for a long moment. "And the flinching, the fear of loud noises," Virginia's hands tightened around her cup. "Edgar believed wives should be seen, not heard, speaking out of turn earned consequences. Eventually, I learned to be silent, to make myself as small and quiet as possible. And when he'd been drinking, any sudden noise could trigger his rage." Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. "That's why you jump at every sound. Your body's still expecting punishment." Virginia nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Virginia," Matthew said, his voice gentle but firm, drawing her eyes back to his, "what happened to you wasn't your fault, none of it." "I chose to marry him," she whispered. "I ignored the warning signs." "You were 17 and alone," he countered. "He was a predator who saw an opportunity. The blame lies with him, not you." Tears welled in Virginia's eyes at the simple absolution in his words. "What will you do now?" Matthew asked. "Will you run again?" Virginia considered the question. For 3 years, running had been her only defense. Yet Edgar had found her anyway, and the thought of starting over again in yet another strange town filled her with exhaustion rather than hope. "I don't know," she admitted. "Laramie is the first place I've felt almost at home. I have customers who depend on me, but Edgar knows I'm here now." Matthew leaned forward, his expression intent. "What if you didn't have to run? What if you could stay and build the life you want right here?" "How? Edgar won't give up." "Neither will I," Matthew stated with quiet conviction. "Virginia, I meant what I said in that alley. You're under my protection now. If you want to stay in Laramie, then we'll make it safe for you to do so." Virginia stared at him. This man who had walked into her life mere weeks ago yet was now offering her the one thing she'd never dared hope for: security. "Why?" she asked again, echoing her question from the night of the gathering. "Why would you do this for me?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to the hands resting on his knees. "My mother," he finally said, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. "My father was like your Edgar, charming in public, a devil at home. She endured 15 years of hell before he finally killed her in one of his rages." Virginia's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Mac, I'm so sorry. I was 12, he continued. Too young to help her then. Too young to understand why she didn't just leave. It was years before I realized she had nowhere to go, no one who would believe her over my father's standing in the community." He looked up, meeting Virginia's gaze with fierce intensity. "I couldn't save her. But I can help you, if you'll let me." Virginia felt something shift inside her chest, a wall crumbling, a door opening. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. "What would helping me entail?" she asked carefully. "First, we ensure Edgar leaves Laramie," Matthew replied. "I have friends in the marshal's office who can make staying uncomfortable for him. Second, we make sure you're never alone until we're certain he's gone for good. And if he refuses to leave," Matthew's expression hardened, "then I'll handle it." Virginia should have been frightened by the steel in his voice, but instead found herself comforted. "I don't want you risking yourself for me." A smile touched Matthew's lips. "I appreciate the concern, but I've faced worse than Edgar Payne and walked away." Virginia didn't doubt it. There was something in Matthew's bearing that spoke of battles fought and won, of principles tested and upheld. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, but I won't hide in fear. I've done enough of that." "Good," Matthew approved. "The best defense against men like Edgar is living well and openly. Shows them they have no power over you." Virginia considered his words. "I've been quiet for so long," she confessed. "I'm not sure I remember how to be loud." Matthew's smile widened. "We'll figure it out together. After all, I promised you could be loud here, didn't I?" The next morning, Virginia woke with a strange sense of lightness. For the first time in years, she'd slept without nightmares, without starting awake at every creak of the house settling or gust of wind against the windows. Telling her story to Matthew had somehow loosened the grip of fear that had constricted her chest for so long. When she descended to breakfast, Matthew was already at the table. He rose slightly as she entered, a gesture of respect that made Virginia's cheeks warm. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes assessing her with concern. "How did you sleep?" "Surprisingly well," she admitted, taking her usual seat. "Glad to hear it. I've been thinking about our situation." Virginia raised an eyebrow. "Our situation?" "Edgar," Matthew clarified. "I made some inquiries this morning. He's staying at the Pioneer Hotel on the edge of town. Already made quite an impression at the saloon last night after our encounter." Virginia's stomach clenched. "What kind of impression?" "The usual drunk, belligerent, making threats he lacks the courage to carry out sober." "That sounds like Edgar," Virginia agreed, pouring herself a cup of tea. "What do you propose we do?" "For now, nothing that would draw attention. I'll escort you to your shop and back. If Edgar approaches, we deal with him directly." "And if he doesn't?" Matthew smiled grimly. "He will. Men like that can't help themselves." Virginia nodded, surprising herself with her lack of fear at the prospect of confronting Edgar again. With Matthew beside her, the thought seemed less terrifying than it should have been. "There's one more thing," Matthew added. "The cattle drive moves on day after tomorrow. I've arranged for my second in command to take over." Virginia looked up sharply. "You're staying behind?" "If that's agreeable to you," he replied, watching her reaction carefully. "I won't leave you unprotected while Edgar remains in Laramie." Gratitude washed over Virginia, along with something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," she said simply. Matthew nodded, seeming to understand all she wasn't saying. Later that morning, Matthew walked Virginia to her shop, his presence beside her drawing curious glances from townsfolk unused to seeing the quiet seamstress with a companion. Virginia felt their stares but kept her head high, determined to follow Matthew's advice about living openly. "I'll be across the street at the gunsmith's," Matthew informed her as they reached her door. Just give a shout if you need me. Virginia smiled at his choice of words. A shout. That doesn't seem very ladylike. Matthew's eyes crinkled. Ladylike is overrated when safety's concerned. Besides, I like the sound of your voice. Wouldn't mind hearing more of it. The compliment, delivered with such casual sincerity, left Virginia momentarily speechless. By the time she'd formulated a response, Matthew had already tipped his hat and moved away, his long strides carrying him across the dusty street. The morning passed uneventfully. Virginia attended to her regular customers, fulfilled orders placed during the cattle drive's arrival, and even managed to complete a rush alteration for Mrs. Preston, the doctor's wife, who needed a dress shortened for a social engagement that evening. Around midday, the bell above her door jangled. Virginia looked up with a smile that died on her lips when she saw Edgar standing in her doorway. "Afternoon, Ginny girl," he drawled, his bloodshot eyes taking in the tidy shop. "Quite the little business you've built yourself here." Virginia straightened, forcing her hands not to tremble as she set aside her work. "What do you want, Edgar? Is that any way to greet your husband?" he asked, his tone deceptively light. "After all this time apart, ex-husband," Virginia corrected firmly, "and I asked you a question." Edgar's false smile tightened. "I want what's mine. You ran off with my money, Ginny." Virginia's laugh held no humor. "Your money? I left Chicago with nothing but the clothes on my back and what little I'd managed to save from my own earnings at the millinery. You'd gambled away everything else." "That's not how I remember it," Edgar replied, moving further into the shop. "But I'm willing to be reasonable. Come back to Chicago with me, resume your wifely duties, and we'll call it even." "No." The word emerged from Virginia's throat with surprising strength. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Edgar. The marriage is over. It has been for years." Edgar's face darkened. "That's not your decision to make." "Actually, it is," came Matthew's voice from the doorway, "and she's made it." Edgar turned, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt before thinking better of it. "Your pet cowboy again," he sneered at Virginia. "What's he charging for his protection?" The implication in his tone made Virginia's cheeks burn, but Matthew appeared unruffled. "You might want to consider your next words very carefully," he advised Edgar mildly. "I'm not known for my patience with men who insult ladies." Edgar snorted. "Lady? You don't know what she is, cowboy. I could tell you stories that would curl your hair." "I doubt that," Matthew replied. "But I know who she is now, a respected businesswoman, a valued member of this community, and someone under my personal protection. That's all that matters to me." Virginia stared at Matthew, warmed by his defense and the certainty with which he delivered it. Edgar glanced between them, his calculating eyes narrowing. "I see how it is. Found yourself a new protector, didn't you, Ginny? Does he know you'll run at the first sign of trouble? That's your specialty, isn't it, running?" "Not anymore," Virginia stated, moving to stand beside Matthew. "I'm done running, Edgar. Laramie is my home now, and you have no place in it." "We'll see about that," Edgar growled, but he backed toward the door nonetheless. "This isn't over, Ginny, not by a long shot." "Actually, Mr. Payne," Matthew interjected, "it is over. The next train east leaves at 4 o'clock. I strongly suggest you be on it." Edgar's face contorted with rage. "You can't tell me what to do, cowboy." "No," Matthew agreed amiably, "but the marshal can. And he's very interested in speaking with you about an outstanding warrant from Denver. Something about unpaid debts and threats against a saloon owner." Edgar paled slightly, confirming Matthew's information. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Matthew challenged, his expression hardening. "Or better yet, don't. Just get on that train and forget you ever found Virginia Thorne." For a tense moment, Virginia thought Edgar might lunge at Matthew. Instead, he spat on her pristine shop floor. "You always were more trouble than you're worth," he snarled at Virginia before storming out, nearly colliding with a startled customer in the doorway. Virginia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "How did you know about Denver?" Matthew smiled. "I didn't, but men like Edgar leave a trail of enemies. It was a calculated guess." "A good one, apparently," Virginia observed, fetching a rag to clean the floor. "Do you really think he'll leave?" "Yes," Matthew said after a moment's consideration. "He's a coward at heart. Bullies usually are. Once they realize their victim won't be easily cowed and there might be consequences for their actions, they typically seek easier targets." Virginia nodded, hoping he was right. "Thank you for coming when you did." "I saw him enter from across the street," Matthew explained. "Gave him a minute to show his hand before interrupting." "Well, your timing was perfect," Virginia assured him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. She could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to surround Matthew, could see the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. Something shifted in Matthew's expression as he looked down at her. "Virginia," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. The bell jangled again as Mrs. Howell entered the shop, effectively ending whatever Matthew had been about to say. "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt," the elderly schoolteacher apologized, noting their proximity. "Not at all," Virginia assured her, stepping back slightly. "Mr. Mackenzie was just leaving." Matthew nodded, seeming to gather himself. "I'll return at closing time to escort you home," he told Virginia before tipping his hat to Mrs. Howell and exiting the shop. Mrs. Howell watched him go with undisguised interest before turning back to Virginia. "My dear, I don't wish to pry, but is there something developing between you and our handsome cowboy boarder?" Virginia felt heat rush to her cheeks. "Mr. Mackenzie is simply being neighborly," she demurred. "Now, how can I help you today?" The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of customers and tasks, but Virginia's mind kept returning to the moment before Mrs. Howell's interruption. What had Matthew been about to say? And more disturbingly, why did she care so much? At closing time, Matthew appeared as promised, offering his arm as they walked back to the boarding house. Virginia accepted it, acutely aware of his solid strength beside her. "Any sign of Edgar?" she asked as they strolled down the main street. "He checked out of the Pioneer this afternoon," Matthew confirmed. "Marshal Johnston saw him purchase a ticket for the eastbound train." Relief washed over Virginia. "Then he's gone." "Appears so," Matthew agreed, though something in his tone suggested caution. "But we'll stay vigilant for a few days, just to be certain." Virginia nodded, trying to process the fact that the man who had haunted her nightmares for years might truly be out of her life for good. The realization was both liberating and disorienting, like stepping into open air after years in confinement. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Matthew glanced down at her. Now you live, Virginia, without fear, without constantly looking over your shoulder. You build the life you want." "And you?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. "What happens to you now that the threat is gone?" Matthew was quiet for several steps. "That depends," he finally said. "On what?" His pace slowed as they approached the boarding house. "On whether I have reason to stay in Laramie beyond my professional obligations." Virginia's heart quickened at his words. "And what might constitute such a reason?" Matthew stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The setting sun cast his features in warm gold, highlighting the earnestness in his expression. "Virginia, he began, but was interrupted by Widow Keller calling from the porch. "There you are. Supper's nearly ready, and I've held it as long as I could. Do come in before everything gets cold." Matthew exhaled slowly, a rueful smile touching his lips. "To be continued," he promised Virginia quietly. Supper that evening was a lively affair. News had spread through Laramie's efficient gossip network about the confrontation in Virginia's shop, though the details had been significantly embellished in transit. By the time the story reached Widow Keller, it involved Matthew facing down 3 armed men to defend Virginia's honor. "Really, it was nothing so dramatic," Virginia insisted as the boarding house matron pressed for details. "Just a disagreement with someone from my past. A disagreement that required Mr. Mackenzie's intervention with a firearm," inquired the railroad clerk, eyes wide behind his spectacles. "I didn't actually draw my weapon today," Matthew corrected mildly. "Sometimes words are enough." "Well, I think it's wonderfully romantic," declared Mrs. Howell's sister, Miss Green, with a significant look between Virginia and Matthew. "A gallant cowboy defending a lady's honor, it's like something from a novel." Virginia felt her cheeks warm for what felt like the 100th time that day. "It was simply one friend helping another," she insisted, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Matthew caught her eye across the table, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he agreed. "That's what friends do." After supper, Virginia retreated to the porch, seeking solitude to sort through her tumultuous emotions. The night was clear, stars emerging one by one in the deepening blue of the Wyoming sky. She breathed deeply, savoring the clean air and the newfound lightness in her chest. Edgar was gone. For the first time in years, she could exhale fully without fear constricting her lungs. "Mind if I join you?" Matthew asked, stepping outside with 2 steaming mugs. Virginia smiled, accepting the offered cup of tea. "It seems we keep finding ourselves here." "Good place for honest conversation," Matthew observed, settling beside her on the porch swing. "No interruptions." "Except when there are," Virginia noted with a hint of wry humor. Matthew chuckled. "True enough." He sipped his coffee, his expression growing more serious. "Virginia, there's something I need to tell you." Virginia tensed slightly. "What is it?" "I received a telegram this afternoon. The cattle buyer in Cheyenne is demanding I personally oversee the delivery." "Oh." Virginia tried to hide her disappointment. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning," he replied, watching her face carefully. "But I'll be back within a week." Virginia blinked in surprise. "You're coming back?" "What about the next drive?" Matthew set his cup aside, turning to face her more directly. "I've been thinking about making a change. 15 years on the trail is a long time. Been considering settling somewhere permanent." Hope fluttered in Virginia's chest, but she tamped it down. "Laramie seems an odd choice for a cattle man." "Not if what he's looking for is here," Matthew replied quietly. Virginia's breath caught. "And what might that be?" Matthew's hand moved slowly to cover hers where it rested on the swing between them. "A future. A home. Someone worth staying for." Virginia stared at their joined hands, his sun-darkened skin against her paler fingers. "Mac, I don't know if I'm ready." "My experience with marriage, I'm not proposing, Virginia," he interrupted gently. "At least, not yet. What I'm suggesting is time. Time for us to know each other better. Time for you to heal fully from what Edgar did to you. Time for you to be certain of what you want." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Virginia's chest. "How practical of you," she managed, attempting humor. Matthew smiled. "I'm a practical man. But I also know my own heart, Virginia. I've known since the moment I saw you kneeling on Widow Keller's floor, trying so hard to be invisible, that you were someone special. Someone worth knowing. Someone worth waiting for." Virginia's throat tightened with emotion. "I'm not the woman you think I am, Mac. I'm broken in ways you can't see." "No," he disagreed firmly. "You're not broken. Wounded, yes. Healing, certainly, but never broken. You survived, Virginia. You rebuilt your life from nothing. That takes extraordinary strength. Tears pricked at Virginia's eyes. What if I can never be normal? What if I always flinch at loud sounds? What if I can never be the kind of woman a man needs? Matthew's expression softened. Virginia, I don't want normal. I want you with all your fears and strengths and everything in between. As for what I need, he paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. I need someone who understands that life leaves scars, someone who keeps trying despite them, someone who looks at the stars instead of the darkness between them. That's you. A tear escaped, tracking down Virginia's cheek. You barely know me. I know enough, Matthew replied simply. I know you're kind to elderly customers who can barely afford your services. I know you volunteer at the church's sewing circle even though crowds make you nervous. I know you're rebuilding a life that someone else tried to destroy. That tells me everything important about your character. Virginia was speechless, overwhelmed by his perception and the depth of feeling behind his words. All I'm asking for is a chance, Matthew continued. When I return from Cheyenne, would you consider spending more time together? Not as boarders, not as friends helping each other through a crisis, but as a man and a woman who might have a future together. Virginia looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity or manipulation. She found only openness, hope, and something deeper that made her heart race. Yes, she whispered, the word emerging from somewhere deep inside her, from the part of herself that had refused to surrender despite Edgar's best efforts to crush her spirit. I would like that very much. Matthew's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then I have every reason to hurry back, he said. Virginia impulsively reached out, her fingers lightly touching his cheek. Be careful in Cheyenne. Matthew turned his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm. Always. The week of Matthew's absence was both interminable and surprisingly productive for Virginia. With the immediate threat of Edgar gone, she found herself breathing more freely, standing straighter, speaking with more confidence to customers and acquaintances alike. When Mrs. Howell suggested Virginia might consider teaching a sewing class at the school, she surprised herself by agreeing immediately, rather than finding an excuse to avoid the social interaction. When the bank manager's wife commissioned an elaborate evening gown for an upcoming territorial social function, Virginia negotiated a fair price without apologizing or undervaluing her work. Small changes, perhaps, but significant in their accumulation. Each tiny act of assertion, each moment of speaking her mind without fear of reprisal, felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that Edgar had stolen. On Thursday afternoon, Widow Keller appeared in Virginia's shop with a meaningful smile. A telegram arrived for you, she announced, handing over the folded paper with poorly disguised curiosity. Virginia thanked her and waited until the landlady reluctantly departed before opening the message. Arriving tomorrow. Stop business concluded successfully. Stop looking forward to our conversation. Stop. Mac. Virginia pressed the telegram to her heart, a smile spreading across her face. Tomorrow. He would be back tomorrow, and they would begin whatever this new chapter might be. That evening, as she closed her shop, Virginia noticed a familiar figure lurking in the shadows across the street. Her heart stuttered with fear before her mind processed what she was seeing: Edgar's unmistakable slouch, the particular way he tilted his head when watching someone he intended to harm. He hadn't left after all, or perhaps he had left and returned, hoping to catch her unprotected with Matthew gone. Virginia's first instinct was to retreat into her shop and lock the door, to hide until help arrived. But something stopped her, a surge of anger that had been building for years, a refusal to cower any longer. Drawing herself to her full height, Virginia strode purposefully toward the sheriff's office, ignoring Edgar's movement to intercept her. She walked with such determination that several passers-by paused to watch, their presence forcing Edgar to reconsider a direct confrontation on Laramie's Main Street. Marshal Johnston looked up in surprise when Virginia burst into his office. "Miss Thorne, everything all right?" "No," Virginia stated firmly. "Edgar Payne is back in town. He's following me, and I have reason to believe he intends me harm." The marshal rose immediately. "Where did you see him?" "Across from my shop, watching from the alleyway beside the apothecary." Marshal Johnston reached for his hat. "Let me escort you home, Miss Thorne. Then I'll have a conversation with Mr. Payne about the meaning of unwelcome in Laramie." "Thank you, Marshal," Virginia said, relief washing through her. "But I should tell you there may be outstanding warrants for him in Denver." Mr. Mackenzie mentioned it. The marshal's eyebrows rose. "Did he now? Well, that's certainly worth looking into." As they stepped outside, Virginia scanned the street, but Edgar had disappeared. The marshal insisted on checking her shop to ensure it was secure before escorting her all the way to Widow Keller's front door. "I'll keep an eye out for your unwelcome admirer," he promised. "And I'll send a deputy to escort you to your shop in the morning if Mackenzie hasn't returned by then." Virginia slept fitfully that night, startling awake at every creak and settling sound of the old boarding house. Yet underlying her fear was a new determination. Edgar would not drive her from another home. She would not run again. When dawn finally broke, Virginia dressed with particular care, selecting a dress in a shade of blue that Matthew had once complimented. She was just pinning up her hair when a commotion downstairs drew her attention. Hurrying to the landing, she found Widow Keller in the foyer, gesturing animatedly to Marshal Johnston while a deputy stood awkwardly by the door. "What's happened?" Virginia asked, descending the stairs with growing dread. The marshal turned to her, his expression grave. "Miss Thorne, I'm afraid there's been an incident." Virginia's hand went to her throat. "Mac, no," the marshal hastened to assure her. "It's Edgar Payne. He was found this morning behind the saloon. There was an altercation of some kind." "Is he?" Virginia couldn't finish the question. "Dead? No, but he's in bad shape. Doctor says he took quite a beating, broken arm, several ribs, and a concussion. Claims he was jumped by multiple assailants, though the bartender swears he started the fight, drunk and belligerent as usual." Virginia sank onto the bottom stair, relief and confusion warring within her. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Marshal Johnston cleared his throat. "He's making accusations, Miss Thorne. Claims Mackenzie paid some local cowhands to teach him a lesson in his absence." "That's absurd," Virginia protested. "Mac would never—" "I know," the marshal interrupted gently. "Mackenzie's not the type for underhanded tactics. If he wanted to deal with Payne, he'd have done it face to face. But I thought you should know what's being said." Virginia nodded numbly. "What happens now? We're putting Payne on today's train east, whether he likes it or not. Turns out those warrants in Denver are quite real. He'll be facing charges there, which should keep him away from Laramie for the foreseeable future." "Thank you, Marshal," Virginia said sincerely. "For everything." After the lawman departed, Virginia sat quietly at the breakfast table, trying to process this latest development. Edgar was truly leaving this time, not of his own volition but by force of law. She should have felt nothing but relief, yet concern for Matthew nagged at her. Would these accusations affect him when he returned? Her worries were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the street outside. Virginia's heart leapt as she rushed to the window, just in time to see Matthew dismounting from his horse. He looked tired but satisfied. The set of his shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. Without pausing to consider propriety, Virginia flung open the front door and hurried onto the porch. Matthew looked up at the sound, his weary expression transforming into a brilliant smile that warmed her from head to toe. "You're early," she called, unable to contain her joy at seeing him. "Couldn't wait another day," he replied, securing his horse to the hitching post and taking the porch steps 2 at a time. He stopped just short of embracing her, suddenly mindful of their public location and Widow Keller's probable surveillance from inside. Instead, he removed his hat, his eyes drinking in the sight of her as though committing every detail to memory. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Virginia blushed. "You look tired," Matthew chuckled. "Rode through the night, seemed important to get back." Before Virginia could respond, the marshal's deputy appeared at the gate, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Mackenzie, Marshal Johnston would like a word when you're settled." Matthew nodded, unsurprised. "About Edgar Payne, I assume," the deputy blinked. "How did you know?" "Word travels," Matthew replied cryptically. "Tell the marshal I'll be along shortly." When the deputy had gone, Virginia touched Matthew's arm. "Mac, there are accusations, I know," he interrupted gently. "Got word in Cheyenne yesterday about Edgar's return. That's why I rode ahead of the herd." "You didn't arrange for anyone to hurt him, did you?" Virginia asked, needing to hear his denial directly. Matthew's expression softened. "No, Virginia. I told you before I handle my own problems face to face. Besides, men like Edgar usually create their own downfall without outside assistance." Relief washed through her. "The marshal found warrants from Denver. They're putting Edgar on today's train." "Good," Matthew said firmly. "Then that chapter is truly closed for you." Virginia nodded, the reality of it finally sinking in. "Yes, I believe it is." Matthew studied her face. "You're different," he observed. "Something's changed." Virginia smiled. "I went to the marshal myself when I saw Edgar yesterday. I didn't hide or wait for someone else to protect me." Pride shone in Matthew's eyes. "I told you extraordinary strength." A discreet cough from the doorway announced Widow Keller's presence. "Mr. Mackenzie, welcome back. You must be famished after your journey. I've prepared a late breakfast if you'd care to join us." Matthew tipped his hat to the landlady. "That's mighty kind, madam. I'll just see to my horse and be right in." When Widow Keller retreated, Matthew turned back to Virginia. "Tonight," he said quietly, "once I've dealt with the marshal and caught a few hours' sleep. Would you walk with me after supper? There are things I need to tell you." Virginia nodded, curiosity and anticipation fluttering in her chest. "I'll be here." The day passed with excruciating slowness for Virginia. She attended to her shop duties mechanically, her mind constantly wandering to what Matthew might want to discuss that evening. So distracted was she that she had to unpick and resew the same seam 3 times before getting it right. From her window, she saw the eastbound train depart, carrying Edgar Payne back to face justice in Denver. She had expected to feel something momentous at this final removal of his threat, but instead experienced only a quiet certainty that this particular shadow would no longer darken her life. By the time she closed her shop and returned to the boarding house, the anticipation had built to an almost unbearable level. She changed for dinner, selecting a simpler dress but taking extra care with her hair, allowing a few auburn curls to frame her face in a softer style than her usual severe arrangement. Matthew was already at the supper table when she descended, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt. Their eyes met across the room, a private current of understanding passing between them, despite the chatter of the other boarders. Throughout the meal, Virginia was acutely aware of Matthew's presence, the deep timbre of his voice, as he answered Widow Keller's questions about Cheyenne. The controlled strength in his hands as he passed dishes, the occasional brush of his gaze against hers that sent warmth cascading through her body. When the meal finally concluded and the dishes were cleared, Matthew stood and addressed Widow Keller formally. "Madam, with your permission, I'd like to escort Miss Thorne for an evening walk." The landlady barely contained her delight at this official declaration of intention. "Of course, Mr. Mackenzie, just be mindful of the hour. A respectable establishment must maintain certain standards." "We won't be long," Matthew assured her, offering his arm to Virginia. The evening was perfect, cool but not cold, the sky ablaze with stars, the moon rising full and golden over the eastern hills. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the small park at the edge of town, where a bench beneath an elm tree offered privacy without impropriety. "You spoke with the marshal?" Virginia asked as they settled on the bench. Matthew nodded. "He knows I had nothing to do with Edgar's misfortune. Seems our friend insulted the wrong cowboy's lady friend and received the natural consequences." Virginia shook her head. "Some things never change." "Some things do," Matthew countered, turning slightly to face her. "Virginia, do you remember asking what would happen next now that Edgar is gone?" "Yes," she replied softly. "I've been thinking about that question for the past week," Matthew continued. "About what I want my future to look like. About what matters to me at this point in my life." Virginia's heart quickened. "And what conclusions did you reach?" Matthew's hand found hers in the dim light. "That 15 years is long enough to wander, that I'm ready to build something permanent. That I've found someone worth staying in one place for." Virginia's breath caught. "Mac, let me finish," he requested gently. "I've arranged to purchase the Wilson Ranch outside of town. It's small by Wyoming standards, only 100 acres, but good land with a sound house and outbuildings. A place where a man could raise a family, where a woman could finally feel secure, where someone who's been quiet for too long could be as loud as she wants." Tears sprang to Virginia's eyes at the echo of his earlier promise. "You're staying in Laramie permanently." "That's my plan," Matthew confirmed, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "But I'll need help. A small cattle operation requires careful management, business acumen, skills I'm still developing." "You'll learn," Virginia assured him. Matthew smiled. "Perhaps. But I was thinking I might need a partner, someone with a good head for business, someone who understands the value of building something lasting." Virginia's pulse thundered in her ears as she realized what he was suggesting. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Mackenzie?" "Among other things," he replied, his voice deepening. "Virginia, I know it's soon. I know you've had reasons to distrust men's intentions. But in the short time I've known you, I've seen your courage, your resilience, your fundamental goodness. I've grown to care for you more than I thought possible." He shifted closer, his eyes holding hers in the moonlight. "I'm not asking for immediate answers. I'm asking for consideration, for the chance to court you properly, with clear intentions and honest purpose. To see if what's begun between us might grow into something enduring." Virginia studied his face, the earnest blue eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the vulnerability behind his confident words. In that moment, she saw not just the man before her, but the possibility of a future she'd never dared imagine, a home filled with laughter instead of fear, a partnership built on respect instead of domination, love freely given rather than coerced. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strengthening as she repeated, "Yes, I would like that very much." The joy that transformed Matthew's face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he raised a hand to cup her cheek. "May I?" he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. Virginia nodded, her heart racing as he leaned forward to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tender, respectful, a promise rather than a demand, and when he pulled back, Virginia found herself leaning forward unconsciously, seeking its continuation. Matthew smiled, pressing his forehead briefly against hers. "We should head back before Widow Keller sends out a search party." Virginia laughed, the sound rising freely from her throat without the constraint of fear for the first time in years. It rang clear in the night air, uninhibited and joyful. Matthew's expression softened as he listened. "That," he said, helping her to her feet, "is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." "What is?" Virginia asked, taking his offered arm. "You," he replied simply, "being loud." The courtship of Virginia Thorne and Matthew Mackenzie became the talk of Laramie over the following months. They did nothing to hide their growing attachment, appearing together at church services, sharing meals at the town's respectable establishments, and often walking arm in arm through the streets that had once seemed so threatening to Virginia. Matthew divided his time between preparing the Wilson Ranch for occupancy and helping Virginia expand her business. With his encouragement, she hired an assistant, a young widow with a talent for embroidery, and began offering ready-made garments in addition to her custom work. As autumn painted the surrounding hills with gold and crimson, Virginia found herself transformed as well. The woman who had once flinched at every sound now laughed freely, spoke her mind without hesitation, and even sang along with the church choir on Sundays. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep gradually receded, replaced by dreams of the future she and Matthew were building together. On a crisp October evening, exactly 6 months after their first kiss in the town park, Matthew invited Virginia to see the completed renovations at the ranch. Widow Keller, now their staunch supporter, insisted on chaperoning the visit, though she tactfully remained on the porch while Matthew led Virginia through the cozy house. "The kitchen still needs work," he explained as they toured the rooms, "but the bedroom upstairs is finished, and I've added a special space I think you'll appreciate." He led her to a sun-filled room at the back of the house, where large windows overlooked the rolling pasture and distant mountains. A sturdy table stood in the center, surrounded by built-in cabinets and shelves. "A sewing room," Virginia breathed, turning in a circle to take in the thoughtful details, the perfect placement for natural light, the storage for fabrics and notions, the comfortable chair positioned to enjoy the view while working. "You like it?" Matthew asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Virginia turned to him, her eyes shining. "It's perfect. You thought of everything." "Not quite everything," he replied, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small box. "There's one more addition I'd like to make to this house." Virginia's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Virginia Thorne," Matthew said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past 6 months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me what it means to be truly brave, to face the world with an open heart despite knowing its cruelties. I love your strength, your kindness, your growing confidence, and yes, even your loudness." Virginia laughed through the tears that had begun to fall. Matthew took her hand in his. "I'm asking you now, officially and with my whole heart, to be my wife, to make this house our home, to build a life together where you never have to be afraid or silent again." "Yes," Virginia answered without hesitation, her voice ringing clear and sure in the sunlit room. "Yes, I will marry you, Matthew Mackenzie." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her in his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, Virginia knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her voice and a man who treasured every sound she made. They were married on Christmas Eve in Laramie's small church, surrounded by friends who had become family. Virginia wore a dress of her own creation, ivory satin trimmed with lace she'd been saving for a special occasion. Matthew stood tall and proud in a new suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked toward him down the short aisle. Widow Keller wept openly throughout the ceremony, while Mrs. Howell and Miss Green nodded approvingly at the culmination of the romance they'd watched unfold. Even the railroad clerk seemed moved, repeatedly polishing his spectacles to hide his emotion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew pulled Virginia into an embrace that lifted her feet from the floor, spinning her in a circle that drew cheers and applause from the congregation. Virginia laughed aloud, the sound echoing joyously in the church rafters. "That's it," Matthew whispered as he set her back on her feet. "Be as loud as you want, Mrs. Mackenzie, for the rest of our lives," and she was. Over the years that followed, the Mackenzie Ranch became known throughout the territory for two things: the quality of its small but growing herd of cattle, and the laughter that always seemed to fill the house on the hill. Virginia continued her sewing business, converting part of the ranch house into a shop where ladies from Laramie and beyond came for her increasingly sought-after designs. Matthew's prediction proved accurate. Virginia's head for business, combined with his practical ranching knowledge, created a prosperous enterprise that grew steadily with each passing year. But their greatest achievement was the family they built together. Their first child, a son they named James after Matthew's father, arrived just 10 months after their wedding, a robust, loud-voiced boy who seemed determined to match his mother's newfound expressiveness from his very first breath. 2 years later, Emily joined the family, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair. 3 more children followed over the next decade: Thomas, Sarah, and little Abigail, each one encouraged to speak their minds, express their feelings, and never hide who they truly were. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised Virginia with a celebration at their ranch, inviting half the town to commemorate the day. As twilight descended and lanterns illuminated the yard where neighbors and friends danced to fiddle music, he found her standing on the porch, watching their children play with the others. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Virginia leaned into his embrace, her head finding its familiar resting place on his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible." Matthew pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know what I was thinking about today?" "What's that?" "The first time I saw you dropping that cup in Widow Keller's parlor, looking so frightened and trying so hard not to be noticed." Virginia smiled at the memory. "I was terrified of everything then, especially tall cowboys with 2 observant eyes." Matthew chuckled. "And look at you now, the most respected businesswoman in the county, mother of 5, and still the loudest person at every gathering." "I am not," Virginia protested, playfully swatting his arm. "There she is," called Mrs. Howell, now silver-haired but still teaching at the school. "The woman who scandalizes half of Laramie County with her unladylike volume." Virginia laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and drawing smiles from their guests. "I've learned from the best," she called back, gesturing to her children, who were indeed creating a considerable din as they chased each other around the dancing adults. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked more seriously. "Taking a chance on me, on us?" Virginia turned in his arms to face him, her hand rising to trace the lines that years of Wyoming sun and wind had etched more deeply around his eyes. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Matthew's smile was as warm as it had been on that first day in Widow Keller's boarding house. "I love you, Virginia Mackenzie. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his, heedless of the onlookers who might raise eyebrows at such public affection between a married couple of 10 years. As if on cue, their youngest daughter spotted them and let out a delighted shriek. "Papa's kissing Mama again," she announced to the entire gathering, drawing laughter and a few good-natured whistles from their friends. Matthew broke the kiss with a chuckle. "She gets that volume from you," he informed Virginia. "And that inability to keep observations to herself from you," Virginia countered, her eyes dancing with mirth. From across the yard, James called for their attention. At 14, he was nearly as tall as his father and showing every indication of inheriting Matthew's quiet confidence. "Speech," he demanded, and the cry was taken up by others until Matthew finally raised his hands in surrender. "Not much for speeches," he began as the crowd quieted, his arm still firmly around Virginia's waist. "But 10 years ago today, I made the best decision of my life marrying this woman. She's made me happier than I had any right to expect and given me 5 incredible children who, as you can all hear, have inherited their mother's healthy lungs." Laughter rippled through the gathering as Virginia playfully elbowed him in the ribs. "But what some of you might not know," Matthew continued more seriously, "is that when Virginia and I first met, she was the quietest woman in Laramie. Barely spoke above a whisper, flinched at every sound." Virginia felt tears prick at her eyes as she remembered those days of constant fear. "I promised her then that she could be loud here, that she was safe to be herself, to take up space, to make noise without fear." Matthew's voice roughened with emotion. "Watching her grow into that promise, seeing her become the strong, vibrant woman standing beside me today, has been the greatest privilege of my life." He raised his glass. "To Virginia, the love of my life, the heart of our home, and the loudest woman in Wyoming territory. To Virginia." Echoed their friends and family, glasses raised in a toast that brought color to her cheeks and tears to her eyes. As the music resumed and their guests returned to dancing, Virginia turned to her husband. "Thank you," she whispered, too moved for her usual volume. "For what?" Matthew asked, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "For seeing me when I was trying so hard not to be seen," she replied. "For hearing me when I could barely speak. For loving me through all of it." Matthew gathered her close. "Easiest thing I've ever done," he murmured against her hair. Virginia pulled back slightly to meet his eyes, her own shining with all the love and joy that had filled the past 10 years. Then, in full voice that carried across their property and perhaps all the way to Laramie, she declared, "I love you, Matthew Mackenzie." Their guests turned at her shout, then broke into applause and cheers as Matthew swept her into another kiss that promised decades more of love, of laughter, of a life lived without fear and filled with joyful noise. The quiet girl who had once flinched at every sound was gone forever, replaced by a woman who embraced life with her whole voice exactly as loud as she wanted to be.